it's a fundamental part of complex game productions. So listen up.
Thanks, everyone. I'm surprised to see so many people here. I'm really happy as well. I've called my presentation "Everything I've Ever Documented." That's a clickbait title, everyone. No. So for the ones who don't know me, I'm Helena. Before I went into games, I have around 10 years in arts management. So I helped galleries and artists with organizing events and organizing their work. I studied at CBS, where I took a master's degree in management of creative businesses or processes, Jesus. And that's when I wrote my thesis, which is a holistic view of the game industry here in Denmark, where I got to talk to a lot of game developers about the challenges that we face and the solutions that they had and how they work and all the institutions that work for a better industry as well. And now I've been in games for around 3 years. And I'm also the founder and the co-organizer of the Danish Game Producers Network, which is where producers can come to events and meet other producers. This was one of the things that I was missing a lot when I became a producer. I didn't know where to find all the producers because even though it's a small industry, I didn't know where to look. So I started it myself. So some disclaimers. This is in fact not everything I've ever documented. I feel like documentation, I have this love-hate relationship with it, which I feel everybody has to some extent. But I think for me, I've sort of transcended this hate part, and now I just want to get really good at it. I want to be able to facilitate, and I want to be able to make sure that everybody is aligned on game projects that I work on or that we work on. And I like to find new ways of doing that. I don't have all the answers, and I have failed several times miserably in trying to organize or document something, but that's just part of the process. Documentation is a practice, and you have to sort of keep going to get good at it. So you just have to sort of dedicate yourself to trying out new things. And I know that maybe documentation won't be a big part of your process here at the Jam, but I think it's also a good exercise if you do. Like how few words can you describe a feature with, or do we have any physical objects that you can, describe this feature with? Like, what does it do for the player experience if we have something fluffy and warm, and what kind of new playful ways can we document our process with here at the Jam? I feel like there's a lot of space for play in documentation, especially if you don't do it for work, but just do it as part of your development process and your facilitation process. So let's get into it. So what this is not is, I can't really tell you how to make good game design documents or art bibles or anything like that, because I'm not an expert in any of those fields. But there's a lot of online game design document how-to guides, and I feel like it came to me when I was doing research for this presentation, that generally there's not a lot of research in game documentation overall. And I think I just thought about how beneficial it would be if we could create some kind of library where everybody shares their templates and how they do things, because we all face the same problems in game development in general. So it feels like we're sort of concurrently all inventing the wheel to some extent. So also a quick note on how much documentation you should do or how you organize it. This is entirely up to the project and up to the company that you work at, or the project that you are working on, because people have a lot of different preferences for documentation. So, you know, some of you might be solo devs just chilling on doing something on the side, and that means that you don't have to, you know, do a stakeholder analysis of your company. You might not need that, but it might be a good way for you to organize your work in general. Yeah, you know, some of you might be working at companies with several hundred employees, and that's where documentation becomes a key process. So agenda for today, the what, why, and when. And then I'm going to go into some examples of different types of documentation. And in the end, we're going to wrap up with a couple of different principles that I think are really important when you think about documentation. So the what's. What's, you know, a lot of people know what documentation is, and I'm not going to explain exactly what it is, but I think that I wanted to give some perspectives on it, and I wanted to give a framework for how you can think about it. So first off, the complexity of communication, a little bit about that. We have two kinds of communication usually. We have the synchronous communication, which is if you're in a meeting and you have all your, you know, employees there, you tell them something, that's synchronous communication. So you have, everybody knows it at the same time. Asynchronous communication is any type of communication where two people aren't expected to be in the same place. So that's when you send an email, you don't expect the other one to answer right away. And yeah, so that's asynchronous. And one of the major, what's it called, complexities is that, as you can see from the picture, a four-member team is 6 distinct communication paths. If you have 8 people, suddenly that becomes 28 communication paths, unique communication paths. So that means like even though small teams might seem small, there's a lot of information or ways that information can flow. And this either leads to sort of over communicating or too much information, or at least to sort of suboptimal communication where you don't always need all 8 team members in a meeting because they don't need all the same information. Some information might be relevant later for them and they are excluded from that meeting. So what to do then? Asynchronous communication can help that, but it's good to be referenced, you know, to work as references, but it can't really fully replace synchronous communication. And as we will see, documentation doesn't always help. It can get lost. You might not write everything down. And it takes longer to write it down than it just does to, you know, go over to somebody and say it. So from this point of view, communication is a really complex thing, and there's no sort of easy solution for how you want to do it. This is a model that I think of when I think about documentation. I sort of invented it for myself. On one hand, we've got this like fluffy versus concrete dimension, and then we have local versus global. And when I talk about local versus global, I'm talking about local as in per game project and global as in company-wide. And I don't think that all types of documentation fits in this sort of model, but I think it's good to have a sort of framework where you think, okay, so what kind of documentation am I trying to write down here, and where does it fit? Is it company-wide or is it just locally for this project? What is the timeline for finishing this documentation as well? So in that sense, I think that we have like game flow diagrams, very concrete, you know, underneath the game project, but deliverables per development phase is a company-wide thing that all game projects then would have to follow. So in that sense, this gives a sort of framework for what we can do for it. So going into fluffy and concrete documentation, I think that fluffy documentation I think of as fiction, framing, and flavor. So it's sort of this like absent presence within games that can be difficult to pin down, but it's really important for all the departments. So if you have desired player experience, that needs to be described, because art might have one idea about the desired player experience, but audio has another. So if you talk about, oh, you know, I want the player to feel nostalgic for childhood memories in this one specific, you know, situation, we need to find ways to describe it by being fluffy maybe, but then afterwards pull it back and say, what can we concretely do per department to support this, this situation or this desired player experience. I've also put world building and setting descriptions in there, and practicing and sharpening game terminology. So as you make fluffy documentation, I feel like you're sort of exploring what words describe your game, and that can be a journey for you. And you know, you constantly find new ways of describing the experience that you want to have the players to have. More concretely, I think that I wrote absolute truths in as far as you can have those. It becomes more about something that you facilitate between employees. So that's like training, templates, you know, terminology. When you have that, becomes very concrete, and you need to be aligned on that, because programmers will understand game mode as one thing, like single or team-based modes, but designers might think of them as like single sessions within a game. So game modes doesn't always mean the same thing. So as soon as you have that, that can really help you align the way you talk about your game with your colleagues. Also something like process descriptions and lists, requirements, data, and flowcharts are also examples of concrete documentation that can help you describe, oh, you know, where does this asset flow through? So if a concept artist makes a sketch, does it go to the 3D artist, or does it go to somebody who needs to sign off before it goes to a 3D artist? Where does it go after the 3D artist? Does it go into the game? Does it go somewhere else? All of these are really important, you know, parts of aligning your team with what happens. It can also make sure that if you get a new employee, that they know exactly what to do with their work to get it signed off. When I'm talking about the whens, I think one of the questions that pops up a lot when we talk about documenting things is, when do I need to do it? When do I need to finish it? And you know, what level does it need to be finished on? And I think that as a rule of thumb, when you step out of a pre-production period, you should have all of your features described in documentation within all departments, so art, audio, design, and tech. During this phase, you know, the pre-production, you're still prototyping things, so things might change, features might change, so you need to start documenting it, and as soon as you lock something down, you finish it up and you move on to something else. But once you have locked yourself into your features, it's really, really important that everybody has the same understanding of what you're making. This is also really important going into a production phase, because unless you have all of your features described, you won't know exactly how much work would go into it and how much work you need to do before you can go into a production. There's a bunch of different statements that I've heard over different periods of time. When you talk about documentation, it's like, we don't have time to create all this documentation. We don't have time to read it. We know how these features work. We've been told verbally, you know, I can just ask my designer about it or whatever. You know, he's right next to me. But as we've just talked about, communication, like synchronous communication, and especially if it's not written down, can be really fluffy, because, you know, you can describe things different ways to different people, and suddenly they will have two different understandings of what they're doing. And as they work on that feature, they might make 2 different things, and you might not find out until 3 weeks later, you know. And then all of that work that they've put in to the feature that they thought was the correct way would have been wasted or would need to be redone. Yeah, and I also think that when we try to describe things, implicit assumptions around what people know is also a massive thing that can cause problems, because if you just describe in your documentation, or if you say that this feature needs to be fun, or it needs to be like, you know, unless you get really concrete with it, you can risk just having people not understanding it, or having a different understanding than you. So documenting your features at the end of pre-production will really align everybody from programmers to audio to art on what you need to do. Yes. The whys. So not only what we've just talked about, we're just gonna wrap up a little bit from a couple of perspectives here. Why create documentation besides the delightful amount of time you get to spend in Excel? So not only internal alignment of the game is really important, you also get to deliver all your documentation to QA, and then they can go through it and be like, I get what you're trying to do here, but there's gonna be like a situation where the player can do this and you haven't described what needs to happen then. Or they'll be like, I can see that you have a specific thing happening in level 90. I need a tool for me to go to level 90 and test this a bunch of different times. So in that sense, you'll have more efficient QA processes and tools if you document it early and if you document well. Not only that, you'll also have better risk analysis and planning, because if you know exactly how much work goes into the different features, you'll be able to, you know, identify which features are high risk and which ones that you need to be extra careful about or need to do extra testing on. And you can actually plan how long a production should be by looking at or you can estimate it at least. You can also have really good collaboration with external stakeholders. And when I talk about external stakeholders, I talk about publishers, for example. I can talk about if you have somebody who needs to do tracking on your game. If they can take a look at your designs and your documentation and say like, well, it would be a business case if we knew, or we would like to analyze this business case of are people actually having the experience that you're documenting or that you're describing in your documentation? Can we track that? Can we put in metrics in the game to actually figure out if they're having that experience? It also lowers the barrier for new employees. So if you're sitting in a company with 10 people, you have everything documented really well, the 11th person would be able to come in and read your design and in theory, understand what you're about to do and know what you've been doing before that as well. Lastly, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later on, it's also really important for archiving and reactivation of the game. So when you're done with a game, where does the game just exists, right? But if you have it documented really well and you suddenly need to do a patch 4 years later, if you don't have it documented well enough, you might have to spend a lot of time trying to rummage through the code or, try to think about why you made these decisions. So for that kind of purpose, it's also really important to have documentation. I know everybody's sitting like this now. We're gonna have some examples now of some of the things that I've been doing throughout time. Some of them are my own, and some of them have been shamelessly stolen for things that from other presentations that I think that you should also see. So the first one is like a high sort of an overview thing. So for example, for a management point of view, it might be really interesting to, streamline the gates and the gate requirements that you need to go through every time you make a game. So for each one of these phases, you would have a clear purpose of why we're doing this phase. And then the rows would simply be each department within your company and the deliverables that they need to do for every phase. This way you can, one is identify where you don't have enough information of where you might go wrong, or if you're not clear enough about the deliverables that each phase requires. So one of the things could be like, for coming out of a concept phase, you will need a full presentation from dev side about what features you're sort of thinking, and from a user research, you need to have internal play tests of the prototype that you're doing, and from a marketing perspective, you might need to have pitch materials or for investors or that sort of thing. And as you go through each of these phases, there'll be more and more deliverables until, basically cert or launch, where, you will have less documentation. But then it becomes really important again at like sunset, the sunset phase, where if you were ever to, reactivate the product again, then you would need all the documentation in a really good form. I put on mood boards because I thought that was a really underrated type of documentation. Mood boards can be incredibly good at conveying emotions and feelings and like memories. So, you have these mood boards with GIFs and imagery and videos and soundtracks, and that's also a form of documentation. And here it's important to say, okay, so putting words on all these feelings that you want the player to experience and getting something concrete out of it later, that's a really important step in this area. So I think it's just a nice type of documentation that is sort of underutilized. We go directly into Excel again. This is actually from a really, really good GDC talk by Sebastian Ebacher. I don't know, I'm probably butchering his name. He's French, from Ubisoft. He was talking about emotion-based creation pipeline. And here you can see a scope assessment. So on the far left here, you can see the scope component and like what it is. And then what he's done, what he's doing with his teams, is he picks out, stakeholders that have some kind of, opinion about these things, that their opinions are important. And then for project impact, each of the stakeholders have to say whether they think it's a must-have, important, or nice to have. For production cost, they'll go like, is it high, medium, or low? Risks, high, medium, low, and quality target above, on par, or shippable. So here you have this matrix of opinions, basically, and it's purely based on these stakeholders, their own department and how important each of these scope components are. And from this matrix, you can then go here, and then you can create this sort of other matrix that will show you whether or not this is a super important component or a less important component. And for the ones that are like red, these are must-haves, but for example, they also have a high risk. So then you have something to sort of discuss between stakeholders whether this high-risk item is actually worth the cost. And like for the ones that are maybe low or less important, those are the ones that you might be able to cut later on, or if you don't have time, or if you feel like this is might not be as important as previously thought. Because sometimes when you think about your scope components, then you're like, oh, every single part of this is obviously important. Everything is important for this game. But as soon as you hear everybody's input on it, maybe the items that you thought was really, really important turn out to be less important. So this is, I think, is a really, it's not a fun way, but it's a good way to start discussions about scope. And this is a model that is fairly known. But it's a really good way of aligning roles within a team. So the ROSI model consists of 4 roles: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And the responsible person is the one that actually does the work. They might delegate or delegate the work or seek support from others, but ultimately they're the ones who are actually doing the work. The accountable person is the one that signs off on the responsible person's work. So they, when the responsible person is done, they give it to the accountable person and then they sign off. The key rule here is that there can only be one person accountable for each of these areas or per area. The consulted is like a two-way communication that you can talk to them about input or feedback, and the informed is a one-way communication line where they are simply informed about the different parts of the game that are being developed. So you can do it super detailed like this if you want, or you can do it more broadly. One of the ways that this really helps is, if you have somebody who's remote or if you have somebody who's junior, then they know exactly who to talk to when their work is done and who signs off and when that happens. So in that sense, it's a really good way to align the roles on your team. And this is also a kind of documentation that needs to be available for the people who need to see it, basically. So this is marketing related documentation. It's based on Chris Zukowski's Steam Tag research model. So I created this in Excel where I basically took each of the competitors that we had, and I put up in the empty cells up there, I put the Steam pictures, the key art, so that I could see how does the key art look like for each of the games. Also, both the small capsule and the large capsule, so that you can see how they manage their information in their pictures. The description, and then I did the tags. I just copied all of the tags that they had on Steam. The top 5 ones are the ones that are most important, actually. So that's why there's a gray area over there. And what I did in Excel was that I did some conditional formatting where, across the 4 columns, if a tag was mentioned once, it becomes red. If it's mentioned several times, it becomes yellow. And if it's mentioned on all of them, it becomes green. So that way you can easily identify which tags that yours also should be if you're in direct competition with these. This way you have a larger or greater sort of chance of getting these games on the you might also like list in the bottom. So this is a great way to say that documentation can also be really useful, because this can just be reused. I can just put new tags in it and you can get new competitors. This is another one that I like to do, streamer lists. So just collecting information about streamers and their numbers is a really good way to have an overview of who you should contact as a company when your game comes out. Sometimes when you're a smaller company, you just want to get out there, you might want to start with content creators that have lower follower lists or follower counts, and then try to, of course, grow. But there's also one theory that is like, if you do some really heavy social media stalking work, you can find like little bubbles of content creators that sort of follow each other across sort of content or follower levels. And then you might be able to actually get to the bigger creators organically by getting to a smaller ones. In my research with this, I also fell across or came across this picture. It's the Twitch Atlas. Somebody used like a bunch of data to map out communities on Twitch, and it just sort of like illustrates how connected people are, especially within like, oh, you know, I play only dungeon crawlers, and maybe they just follow a bunch of different content creators who also do dungeon crawlers. And if you get into that bubble, then maybe you can, get to some of the big ones or create collaborations or at least encourage collaborations between them. I used Social Blade. It was painfully manually done to get all of their streamer data. But I'm pretty sure that if you're more Excel savvy than I am, you can create queries and connections that can scrape information from different pages and maybe automatically update this. Because that's one of the tricky things about streamer lists is that their follower accounts often change. So obviously it's not like an absolute truth. So somebody who had 250 might have 1,000 in a month. So this is another one of these more concrete documentation that I would really recommend everybody gets, because this is an asset request list. This is for Steam. Basically what I did was I took all of the store graphical assets and the community graphical assets, and I just put in what they wrote in the documentation, and like got it, oh, is it required, is it optional, the size, if there's extra notes or requirements like format, and then put it in a list, because I got so tired of just trying to find it over and over again. And I think that's one of the telltale signs of like needing documentation is when people, they start asking the same questions, like, what was the size of that one picture key art that you needed for Steam? Like, what's it used for? What format should it be? All of these things. So you can definitely just put all of that information in here, and you will always have the information at hand. Of course, if Steam decides, which they could, to change anything, it's up to you to update it, of course. And you can do the same thing with PS and Xbox and Nintendo, because all of these things are essentially something that you'll do over and over again, and it's really good to just have it at hand in that sense. Another thing that might be like a little bit more sort of overview-like is asset pipeline diagrams. So these two I took from two different sources, and basically it's what I talked about in the beginning, where what happens to different assets and different kinds of asset as we go through development. Do we have any special requirements for each of these phases or each of these departments that it needs to go into? What happens before, or like concurrently within these processes? And I think one of the reasons why you want to do this is just to have an idea about, you can add time for each of these phases. Say like, I need this asset to only be in this phase for about a week, then it needs to go out, or it needs to go back into another round of iteration. So you can sort of track the progress and track the progress of each of these assets. It's also just a good way to have every part of the game project and every department see how they work together, and maybe you can even identify the bottlenecks that you're experiencing. Let's see. This is a really good Yeah, this is a good kind of documentation because it's done in post-production most likely, but it's using documentation that you've done throughout the game basically, or the game production. So closing kits are archival work. It's basically a kit that contains all of the information that you've ever collected about your game into one kit, so that is easily sort of navigable or navigatable. I don't know. But yeah, as it's written in the game production handbook, like if you want to port it, localize it into another language, develop a sequel, any type of process that will require the game's original source assets, codes, and tools. So in that sense, what you're doing is you're creating a map for external stakeholders to navigate your game. And this is sort of the content that, and it's non-exhaustive, of course, that you can put into a closing kit. It doesn't only contain game design documents, it also contains all your technical documentation, legal information, if you have any middleware, if you're using any plugins that is necessary to create new content, how to build a version, if you have specific procedures across different departments, that's also where you would describe it. An important part is the localization kit. So if you have any like game scripts or voice actors that you used, or if you have any synopsis of stories, that sort of thing, it's also a really important part to be able to localize it into another language. All your videos and marketing documents also go in here. And then if you have any first-party documentation, like validation reports, previously encountered bugs, that sort of thing, as well as your age rating. So in that sense, I think that a closing kit is like the ultimate map of your game. You have, like, somebody can get this kit and they can just, if they know what they're looking at, they can talk about your game and they can identify what they need. Yeah, that's a lot to process. So sort of wrapping up a little bit, I think that the principles here are the ones that I think about when I think about documentation. So for me, documentation is a collaborative activity. You need to make sure that somebody sees it. You need to make sure that they understand it, they give feedback on it, and that it actually fulfills the purpose, someone's purpose. So you really need to make sure that you talk to people when you do documentation. It's also a visible activity. You want to make sure that people know where to find the documents. You want to make sure that they, that you're keeping a centralized library of it. Because if you have documents in Google Drive, in Confluence, and on your, table, then your knowledge center is fragmented, and you won't be able to actually have everything in one place where people can find it. I also think that even though you need to have your documentation finalized by pre-production, documentation is sort of an ongoing thing, because things can still change even though you're in production, or you might find out that you're localizing to a 22nd language or something like that, where you're just like, okay, well, we need to put more documentation about this. So as the production changes, so does your documentation. And as we talked about in the beginning, documentation is a practice and is something that you need to sort of stay dedicated to. So you just need to bite the sour apple, as you say in Danish, and update it as you go along. I also want to say that some good documentation notes. Do not make assumptions about previous knowledge when it comes to documentation. Like, don't just assume that they know where, what something is, or where something should be located. Just write it out real quick. It doesn't take very long, and it really helps, especially when you're lowering barriers for new employees. Put links in it to other documentation. Say, like, if you're describing one feature and it links to another feature, link it to the other feature. Because then you know exactly where to find it as well. And the last one, do not, for the love of God, put abbreviations that are internal in your documentation, because this is probably the worst thing that you can do. You're forcing somebody to like ask, what does NSP mean? And it's like, oh, it's a non-susceptible person, you know? And it's like, what? Why didn't you just write that out, you know? So don't put internal abbreviations in your documentation, because that is going to help a lot of people. Yeah, thanks for listening, and thank you for staying put throughout.